there is a very direct relationship between the socialism that once existed and the weakness of the socialist alternative today. And there is no getting away from that. And people who try and cover up what happened in the past don't do anyone any favors. Because one reason for the lack of a socialist alternative today is the collapse of the old system. And we have to see why that system collapsed and what were its features which actually were in contradiction to many of the things that the founders of socialism had taught. And the fact is that there was an enormous contrast between the vision of a socialist society as developed by Marx and Engels and their early supporters, and what actually turned out to be the practice of the system. The system loosely sketched out by Marx, and the reality of what existed in the 20th century, and the states that defined themselves as socialist, the gap between the two is huge. Really large. Why? Economically, the countries that accepted the socialist system, what were they? Austere, economically backward, total output constrained by scarcity, low productivity of labor. Politically, dominated by authoritarian state apparatuses, which denied civic liberties to the people, expropriated the rights of association and organization that had been considered elementary, culturally, an official monopoly of the means of communication, a repressive regulation of ideas, and an exaltation in many cases of the nation, and a system in which bureaucracy became the master of social life. Now, I generalize this, but of course within this system there were variations. And many of us, when we compared, for instance, the former Yugoslavia to Eastern Europe or the Soviet Union or leave alone China, often considered this to be a much milder version of what existed elsewhere, as a model to look at it, to see some of the experiments that took place here. Also, culturally, these countries varied. After the thaw of 1956, for instance, in Czechoslovakia and Hungary, enormous developments were made in the cultural realm, just in one field, the cinema. If you look at some of the Czech cinema, or the Eastern European New Wave, though by and large it was restricted to Hungary and Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia, of course, which had its own cinema industry, very, very strong and powerful, they produced amazing stuff, sometimes using allegory as a form to make certain arguments. But by and large, the social, economic, political forms of what existed was remote, really remote, from the expectations of the founding fathers of socialism. Because for Marx himself, socialist societies would be based on the economics of abundance. The political order would be based on a radical popular sovereignty. The producers of wealth would be given for the first time ever the means of democratic self-government in factories, fields, municipalities, and assemblies. That was what the argument was, and that was what people fought for. Culture would be diverse, variegated, developing new forms, innovating, moving beyond all existing boundaries, beyond capital and nation. This didn't happen, and we know why it didn't happen. It's because By a twist of fate, most of the countries in which socialism was introduced were countries that were not economically advanced. And this is why even the early leaders of the Russian Revolution were praying for the German Revolution, so that at least one economically advanced country could make the revolution and break their isolation. That didn't happen. That didn't happen. So the isolation of these states, if you like, one can go even further. In all the big countries, or even smaller ones, where the socialist state was created, it didn't develop organically from the rise of industry and workers in their own countries, but usually was created by external circumstances. The First World War and the collapse of the Russian armies produced the Russian Revolution, because the Tsarist system was not as weak as we now like to think. It was quite a strong system, bolstered by its victories in the Napoleonic Wars, quite strong ideologically, quite strong militarily. It was the defeat of those armies in the clash with Germany which created the collapse of that society and the victory of the Russian Revolution. China, exactly the same. Had the Japanese not occupied China, it is very unlikely that the communists in China would have made a revolution. The nationalists were much, much stronger than them. And it was only the Japanese invasion and the nationalist collaboration with the Japanese which antagonized large parts of the Chinese population. But it also created a very different trajectory between Russia and China, which I will return to in a minute. But by and large, that is how, and in Yugoslavia, how would Yugoslavia have turned socialist? How could unless there had been a German occupation and a partisan resistance? So it was the First World War produced the Russian Revolution, the Second World War produced revolutions in China, in Yugoslavia, and in Vietnam. And so these are not, there's nothing, that's fine that these things happen, but they help us to understand the processes which created these revolutions. And then these revolutions tried in a voluntaristic way to make up for the fact that they were economically backward and to move forward, and they achieved some successes. That has to be admitted. So when I am asked about these old societies, I say that a useful way to describe them is as social dictatorships. They were dictatorships, there's no doubt about that, because of what I've already described to you. But these social dictatorships also produced a system which attempted, with varying degrees of success, to give its population a higher quality and higher standards of life. In terms of the social infrastructure that was created, there's no doubt it educated a population which had been deprived of education. It attempted to provide cheap subsidized housing, cheap subsidized public utilities, cheap transport, and that many people still remember. Because if you visit the former Soviet Union or even the former Yugoslavia, many people remember the social rights that were given them and which they took for granted. And they remembered them especially when the system of neoliberalism took them all away. And where money became the only criteria for determining what people could have and what they couldn't have. But the basic problems of the system couldn't be solved.